Okay.
He was like in the middle of a sentence.
All right, here we go. America's first sex goddess, Marilyn Monroe. Now, if you talk about movies and actresses and performers in the 1960s, probably no one stood out as much as Marilyn Monroe did. Everybody knows who Marilyn Monroe is. But she had kind of an interesting life, and I'm going to give you kind of a rundown of her life. She did not have an easy childhood, I will just tell you that, not at all. And probably some of the problems that she had in life were because of this. But some of you may know this if you're Marilyn Monroe fans. She was actually born Norma Jean Baker. And she was born in Los Angeles in 1926. She was born Norma Jean Baker. She was born in Los Angeles in 1926. At the age of 16, she married a 21-year-old fellow by the name of James Doherty. When she was just 16 years old, she married a 21-year-old man by the name of James Doherty. Now, the only reason she really married the guy wasn't out of love. She married him to avoid being put into another foster home. She married him to be, to avoid being put in another foster home. Now, her life started out kind of tough because Marilyn's mother was an unwed mother, which was a very difficult thing to be during that time in history. That was not very well accepted. And so you had a strike against you right off the bat if you were an unwed mother, and the child probably wasn't looked at any differently. Well, pressure got to her mother, and because her mother got kind of off her rocker, so to speak, they put her into a mental institute, which forced Norma Jean to live in various foster homes. So her mom was an unwed mother, and that wasn't the thing to be at the time. And a lot of pressures and not very good life put her mother into a mental institute, which forced Norma Jean to live in various foster homes during her early life. Now we get back to her marriage to James Doherty. It was considered a good one. He considered Norma Jean a good wife despite her young age. And you've got to remember in those days, wives had a little different role than they do now. A lot of them didn't work. They stayed home and cooked and took care of the house and tended to their man and their children. That's kind of what they did. That was their job. I really admire women who do that now. It's just a tough thing, you know. I have a daughter-in-law that I have two granddaughters. By the way, I'll be here, maybe in class Friday. And I admire my daughter-in-law because she stays home and raises the girls. I mean, she's in a situation where daycare costs so much now you can't. By the time she went to work, she'd be giving all her money to daycare. But it's tough, and that's what you did in those days. Okay, you stayed home, cooked for your husband, cleaned the house, took care of the kids. They did not have any kids. She really wanted to have a baby with Doherty because he was scheduled to leave to serve his country in World War II. Okay, so she was really pressing him to have a baby because he was leaving and was going to serve in World War II. Why would she press to have a baby before he left? Or at least be prepared for it. What's that? Yeah, she thought he may be killed in the war, and she wanted kind of a piece of him if something happened to him when he was in the war. So she was kind of thinking ahead. She wanted to have a baby with Doherty, and mainly she wanted to have that baby because he was scheduled to leave and serve in World War II, and she wanted to have a piece of it in case her husband did not survive. But you got to give Doherty credit here. He believed she was too young to have a baby, didn't want her to raise the baby by herself, and so he talked her out of having. So he took off to serve his country in World War II and left her behind. And she had a little bit of a talent. She was a good-looking young lady. And she became very photogenic. And she began to pose for photographs, appeared on the cover of many magazines. And she made her money serving as kind of a model. Very photogenic, pretty lady for the day. She posed for a lot of different photographs, appeared on the cover of several magazines. Now, it's kind of an interesting story because her husband didn't know she was doing this for a living. So he's in the service and he picks up a magazine and he sees her on the cover of the magazine. And he's all excited about it. He tries to convince his buddies, hey, this is my wife. My wife's on the cover of this magazine. And their reaction was, yeah, right. Yeah, right. But it was true. So she actually made her living being modeling, that type of thing, was on the cover of magazines. Her husband picks up a magazine, sees his wife on the cover, tells all his army buddies this is his wife, and they didn't, their whole thing was right. Sure she is. Well, it happens sometimes when Doherty was away from home at war and the marriage was kind of done out of necessity rather than maybe love. Norma Jean's interest in marriage kind of faded. And poor old James Doherty opened his mail in the service and he received the old Dear John letter. Anybody know what that is? Too young to know what that is? That's the old, breaking up is a little different, kind of, but they're married, so she's divorcing, okay? So he receives, the poor old bugger receives in the army the old Dear John letter, and Norma Jean informs him that she has not only filed for divorce, but she's changed her name. Poor old Doherty. Well, you know how she got the name Marilyn Monroe from Norma Jean Baker? You know where Marilyn came from? Anybody know that? That was her grandmother's middle name. And what was Monroe, you think? It was simpler. Mother's maiden name. Okay? So her new name was Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn after her grandmother's middle name, and Monroe was her mother's maiden name. So the marriage to Doherty actually lasted 4 years, and it ended in Marilyn's first divorce. So if it's a first divorce, you can imagine there might be more than one, right? So her marriage to Doherty lasts 4 years and ends in Marilyn's first divorce. Now, Marilyn always had the dream of being in show business. And what is show business now? They used to call it show business. What's show business? Movies, be an actress, maybe an entertainer, singer. She wanted to be in show business. But how do you get, I've told you kids a lot of times when you apply for things, it's not what you know, it's who you know. So in order for her to get into show business, she was going to have to make the right connections to get her foot in the door. That's just how it is. If you want to be a musician, entertainer, Keith Urban, whatever, you got to be good, but what do you have to get? You're going to get a break and have some connections sometimes. Okay, I'm sure there's some wonderful singers that never ever became famous singers because they never got the break, never got their foot in the door. Well, after much effort in getting the right connections, she ended up being pretty successful, and she starred in 28 films during her career. The first one was in 1948. 1948. Looking for a book over here. I want to get to it in a minute, so just keep writing down. So she starred in how many films? 28. And the first one in 1948. 1948. I'll be darned. Sometimes I can reorganize myself into loss. Well, how do you become America's first sex goddess? What? What? Well, you don't quite go straight to there, but something had to happen to get her attention. So you can imagine she's a pretty lady. She was on the cover of a lot of different magazines, that type, and she was asked many times to pose nude, many times, and always refused, would not do it. Okay? So that was not uncommon in the day. Hugh Hefner was making a living putting together a magazine called Playboy magazine, and he liked to find gals that would pose nude, for example. Well, here's a story for you. Talk about being in the right place at the right time. So, during the time she was in her photography career, and that would be getting pictures taken of you with your clothes on, she was on the way to a very important audition. And she wrecked her car on the way to the audition. Wrecked her car. And she panicked because why? She's going to be late, not make this audition that was pretty important. So a man stopped to help her, He gave her $5 to catch a cab to her audition so she wouldn't be late, and made arrangements to kind of get her car lined out so she didn't have to worry about it. Well, you'll never guess what the profession was of that guy that helped her. What do you think he was? He was a photographer. And so, he asked her to pose nude for him. And because he kind of saved her bacon on this audition and got her where she needed to be, she agreed. Well, obviously those photos made an impression upon somebody, and it came to be that she would be appearing on the cover of the first ever Playboy magazine. Now, here's what it looked like. I actually have one I finally found. I thought the hunter stole it from me. Barry, if you can get a first edition, first printing of that, we looked them up. How much were they? To $8,000-$10,000 you can find an original. Very, 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 very rare. Well, after she divorced James Doherty, she got married a second time, this time to Joe Dimaggio. Joe Dimaggio, and they married on January 14th of 1954. Joe Dimaggio. Now, Pete, I bet you know who that is, don't you? Pete, Joe Dimaggio is probably the most famous baseball player at the time. He played for the New York Yankees. He still holds the Major League record for getting a base hit in 56 consecutive games. And you can imagine with the new technology in baseball that, boy, that's something. He's held that since the 50s. What that means, if you're not a baseball fan, is you go up to bat, you strike out. You get up to bat, you ground out. You get up to bat, you fly out. But you get up the fourth time, you get a base hit and get on base. He got on base 56 consecutive games where he got at least one base hit, which the record has never even been close. I think Pete Rose was the closest with like 44. But every time somebody gets on a hitting streak of about 20 or 30 games, they start bringing that back up again. But it's a record that will never, in my opinion, ever be broke. He was one of the greatest baseball players that ever lived on the planet. Well, anyway, they married. And obviously, because of their careers, the marriage was strained. I don't know how easy it'd be to be married to a gal that was America's sex goddess and was in Playboy magazine. I mean, you'd have to be willing to share to a point, at least the images, with everybody in the world. I think that would be difficult. And their divorce ended on their marriage ended on October 27th, 1954. When were they married? Did I tell you that? Yeah. What year? Yeah, it didn't last long, did it? October 27th, 1954. And the reason they got, I mean, other than the fact that their careers took them apart quite a bit, Dimaggio became increasingly annoyed with the phoniness of the movie industry. He just thought it was a bunch of BS. He hated the movie industry.
When did they get married?
They got married, did I not tell you that? January, maybe I did. Did I tell you that? I said it quick. Okay, they got married on January 14th, 1954, and they divorced on October 27th, 1954. Now, he became increasingly annoyed with the phoniness of the movie industry, and he did not like his wife's blonde bombshell roles in these movies. He thought it portrayed her kind of stupid, you know what I mean? And so, he became annoyed with the movie industry. He didn't like the movie industry at all. Well, the final straw with the whole thing happened when she was filming a movie called The 7-Year Itch. She was filming a movie called The 7-Year Itch. And Dimaggio was invited by his wife to accompany her as they were, filming that. And at first he decided he wasn't going to go. He just had enough of the movie business. But later he reconsidered and he traveled to New York where the film was being shot. And decided to kind of take part, try to make things work. Well, their marriage went from disharmony, which wasn't good, to disaster during the filming of The 7-Year Itch because of a scene in the film. And what happens is Marilyn is standing above a subway grate, and you walked across those when we were in DC. Remember that you wondered where that was coming from? And a train rushes beneath her and throws her white dress over her shapely legs. Nothing really inappropriate, but it shot her dress over her legs. And Dimaggio did, it was kind of the last straw. He thought, my God, this is just ridiculous, the movie industry, what it portrays my wife to be. And when her wife blew up to reveal her shapely legs, it was more than Dimaggio could take. He stormed off the set and said, what the hell's going on here? He was not interested in more than 2,000 strangers seeing his wife in this predicament or position during the film. And I think probably she was enjoying it too much for his liking as well. Well, shortly after that event is when they filed for divorce. And it was kind of sad because history will tell you that Joe Dimaggio loved Marilyn Monroe a lot. And she loved him a lot. But it just wasn't working. I mean, their careers had him apart. He was jealous of the film industry. He didn't like his wife being out there portrayed as a sex goddess for everybody in the world to see. And it was kind of sad because even though they divorced, I think they still had great feelings for each other, which obviously her and James Doherty did not have. Okay? Kind of a sad breakup, actually. He was just too jealous. He couldn't take it. Well, she remarries for a third time in 1956. And she marries, some of you might know this fellow, a playwright by the name of Arthur Miller. Anybody heard of Arthur Miller, the playwright? Yep. She marries Arthur Miller in 1956. He's no Joe Dimaggio, I'll just tell you that athletically. Very bright guy. Very brilliant playwright, but... And again, you got a famous playwright and a famous movie star, and what happens? We have careers that clash, and they divorce in 1961. So she's been through the mill a little bit. And I think a lot of it's because of her dysfunctional home life when she was young. But she's been through 3 husbands by 1961. Well, we talked a little bit about this, but I'll give you the real details on it. Probably her most famous performance ever was May 19th, 1962. What happened on May 19th, 1962, Morgan? She sang Happy Birthday to President Kennedy. And she did that at Madison Square Garden in New York City for his 45th birthday. But I'm going to tell you how it all happened. I'll give you the whole story, because it's an interesting one. So, the most famous performance ever given by Marilyn Monroe, people remember her the most for that one that occurred on May 19th, 1962, when she was scheduled to sing Happy Birthday to President Kennedy at Madison Square Garden in New York City for his 45th birthday. Now, somebody had to choose her to do this, right? And the man that chose her as the focal point was Richard Adler. This guy right up there, right above Macklin. Here you can see kind of a then and now. Richard Adler. He was the chairman of the events at Madison Square Garden. And Richard Adler was the man who chose Marilyn Monroe as the focal point of the president's birthday party. Now, who would be concerned about this other than Jackie? I knew that was coming. Who would be concerned about this other than Jackie? Well, Robert. Who else would be concerned about it? Any of his aides or anybody in his administration. And the reason they were concerned about Marilyn Monroe coming to sing is because there were rumors around that the president and Monroe were an item, which they actually were. So there was big concern within the Kennedy administration and Kennedy's closest aides about Marilyn Monroe appearing because of rumors that she and the president at the time were an item. Now, she was scheduled to wear a very seductive nude designer gown. They actually, it was so tight, they sewed it on her body. She didn't put it on, they sewed it on. Okay? They sewed it on. It was a very sexy nude designer dress that was so tight that they sewed the dress on her. The dress, as you see right here, cost $12,000 in 1962. $12,000. It sold at auction in 1999 for $1.3 million. This is the dress at the performance and on display. That dress sold for $1.3 million in 1999. Well, getting back to the story. Early in the morning of May 19th, Richard Adler considered canceling Monroe's appearance because he was starting to get concerned about the president's image. So he started wheeling his mind, maybe this isn't a very good idea to have Marilyn Monroe do this. So sometimes when you're trying to decide whether something's right or wrong, what do? What's that?
You consulted someone.
Yeah, you consult somebody you can trust. And he had an old friend by the name of Jack Benny. And Jack Benny, you don't know who he is. Your grandparents might. If you have great-grandparents, they might. But Jack Benny was kind of a comedian like Johnny Carson, before Johnny Carson. And he had his own variety show and that type of thing. But he was pretty famous in the 1960s, Jack Benny. Unfortunately, I don't have a signature in him. He's almost impossible to find. So Adler calls an old friend, Jack Benny, and he tells him what he's got planned for the president for his birthday. Okay? This is what Adler said. Or excuse me, this is what Benny said after Adler described what was going to happen. You have to write this down, just listen. He said, "Get somebody else. What kind of a schmuck are you anyway, getting Marilyn Monroe to sing happy birthday to the President of the United States?"